So let's talk about, welcome, looking ahead, blended learning opportunities for the future. Please access the links to the slides at bit.ly/blend-IU14. And I thank you all for coming out today and being willing to think about this with me. My name is Lynn Hiltz. I'm a program administrator at the Office of Professional Development and Curriculum at BCIU. And we've reached the point, friends, where I use Snapchat photos as my introduction because we are all in that space right now. So welcome. Today's session, there are four main components. We are going to talk about important questions. Why are we here? Why are so many of you interested in exploring these ideas? And what are some key considerations we know? Blended Learning 101. I'm not a huge fan of the use of buzzwords in education, but blended learning is something that is worth exploring in terms of possibilities for supporting our learners in these uncertain times. We don't know what it's going to look like next year. We don't know how often kids are going to be face-to-face with us or how many kids at a time we're going to have. We don't know what types of online learning they're going to be asked to do. So it's worth exploring this idea of blended learning to get some ideas in our minds about how we can pull this off. Challenges, we know that there are a number of challenges. While they are common to all of us, there are also unique challenges that certain school districts face that others won't. And so there are a number of roadblocks that we can talk about generally, but certainly as a district, you'll dive down and you'll dig deeper and address your own challenges. And then looking towards opportunities that we have to bring these ideas to life. We can overcome a lot of the challenges when we put the focus on building trustworthy relationships with one another and keeping that the focus, and not just with teachers and admin and students, but also with their families and communities. So to start, I would love to hear from you, and I just think it's a good exercise for you to tell us about what questions you have at this time. So on the next slide, and I'll put the link in the chat as well, I've developed a Padlet board, and it's just a looking ahead questions activity. What questions do you have right now about school and learning realities for 2021? There's no right or wrong question. You don't have to attribute your name or your district to it. This is a Padlet wall that has been set up for kind of like an ongoing discussion. I put the link in the chat for you. You can type in the bottom your question, like how many students will be permitted to be in a classroom at one time? That's a legitimate question that you might have. And when you click post, it's going to pop up there for us on the screen. So I want you to take a moment. This is a participatory session. Write out some of your questions, post them for your peers so we can collectively kind of take a look at what questions are coming through. Occasionally, I will hit refresh so you can see the questions coming in. So I'm going to give you just some wait time here. Now, if you've already added your question, you can go ahead and you can scroll up and down. You can see kind of, now since I'm the board creator, it went over here, which is awesome. What should we focus on during end of the year professional learning? When will our districts know schedules so we can prepare? How do we get students involved that do have access to digital learning opportunities, but they aren't participating? So that's a student motivation piece, which is a great question. How different will our beginning of the year students look than what we are used to? I think keeping that in mind is really important too. There's some questions coming in too. I purposely did not put the CDC guidelines in this presentation today. And, that blue graphic that is circulating the internet, that's not an official CDC publication. It was created by an individual who was looking to pretty much incite an emotional reaction from whoever saw it, which was 100% the case. So while that person picked and chose items out of the guidelines, I'm actually not even going to call them guidelines because they're not hard, fast guidelines. They're more like recommendations. So I think we've all kind of worked ourselves up about these CDC quote unquote guidelines when there is clear language that says schools need to do what's feasible, what's practical for their own school communities, which is what your administrators are working through right now. How do we get kids onto a school schedule when they're not in school? How do we address students' SEL needs? These are the really important questions that all of you as educators who care about kids are coming up with and want to have answers to. And I really want to be able to, I would love to be able to just type the response right here for you. I really do. And I know that your school leaders do too. And you can feel free to ask questions as parents too. If you're parents of a school-age child, my goodness, you have a lot of questions as well. If your offices are opening back up and you're reporting to work every day and your kids are only going to school a couple times a week, oh my goodness, how are we going to do that? So these are wonderful questions. These are the types of questions that when we are working together in our teams, as we're planning and hopefully giving our voices into the planning process, these are the things that we have to advocate and question for, okay? So the questions are definitely there. Nobody doubts that. What I want you to know is that even though there aren't hard and fast schedules that are being published at this time for most of our county schools, this work is happening on your leadership team levels, and many of you might be involved in that. But primarily, when we meet with your school leaders as BCIU teams, your leaders want to know how we can make social emotional learning the focus of this transition, because for the past 2 months, we know that there's been incredible trauma happening to students, to families as a result of the pandemic. And it's not just been an interruption of schedules, but there have been families that have experienced loss due to COVID, and there have been just situations outside of our specific locus of control that have truly traumatized people. And so that has to be the focus as we're transitioning back to learning. So while absolutely, as educators, we want to keep high academic standards and rigor, that type of thing can't be the focus right now. And if you're somebody who is just insistent that we consider and keep doing, as tough and as stringent grading practices that we've always been doing, and we have to keep the course workload as high as it's been, that's just not realistic, and it's just not good for kids, and it's just not good for people in general. So keeping that SEL focus, this might be a time when we have to think differently about our priorities. There's going to be some creative scheduling coming out. We're going to have to maximize the time that we have in face-to-face settings. And maybe we'll be able to start the school year out where everybody reports to a physical school building and classes look the way they were. And maybe we'll report half of the time, or maybe we'll be using every inch of the school building to spread out kids as far as possible. We can do these types of things creatively within our school's means, while also protecting the health and well-being of our faculty and our students and our families and everybody on staff. It's going to require creativity for sure. And in terms of content, keeping this in mind, how are we going to help students explore the most relevant content that they need in this time to ensure that they continue to be learners? And what does that look like? And this is not a point to say that certain disciplines are more important than others. There are ways to incorporate all key disciplines academically during this time in ways that make sense for all kids. So those are the types of creative conversations we need to start having. This was a graphic shared by a school leader, just kind of showing the decision-making process and some key questions that we can think about. Whether we have a 100% online back to school in the fall, whether we look for like a blended or a hybrid version, or whether we have some kind of modified face-to-face setting. And these are questions that we have to talk about as a faculty and as a team. Who's involved in the planning? Are all stakeholders involved? Are teacher voices involved? Are student groups who are traditionally marginalized, do they have representatives advocating for them? What does the research say? What are other countries doing? What does our experience, past practice show that we can be successful in doing? How do we make sure that we are not physically separating students or by isolating them? We don't want to create a learning environment that isolates children. We can still support peer socialization in ways that connect kids, but that can also help them stay safe. What does that look like? Designing schedules and learning from a humanistic perspective, having that sense of empathy, helping students shape the learning environment based on what they need. And then, of course, gathering stakeholder voices. Now, if you are a classroom teacher and you're saying to yourself, well, I'm not even involved in the planning, I'm just waiting to find out what's going to happen to me, I would encourage you to be proactive. You have stakeholders in your realm. You have students that you've worked with in the last couple of months, and you have parents that you've worked with in the last couple of months. And it's as simple as reaching out, if it's a Google form, if it's a message in Dojo, whatever your venue is, and just saying, how did it go? What are we doing well for you and your family? What is working for you? What is definitely not working for you? How could we improve this? Or how could we do this differently? You have the opportunity to build that in. And I'm telling you, your districts might be doing that at the district level, but you have such a more personal relationship with your students and families that I bet you will get more personal feedback than a district-wide survey will. And so for your own planning purposes, if you are able to reach out to your families and if you are able to just get a feel for what worked with your content area, your discipline, your grade level, you will be able to take that information with you moving forward and better plan for that. So let's talk about what some blended learning options are and what blended learning is. And hopefully that will give you, if you don't have experience in that, some ideas, just some brainstorming, just maybe some light bulbs will go off about what life could look like in a blended learning environment. So first I want to hear from you. Blended learning is ... How would you define blended learning? Go ahead and take a minute, sit on that. If you want to Google it, I can't stop you. And add your definitions or ideas in the chat, and we'll see what comes in. So we have some ideas coming in. A mix of digital learning and traditional, when you use both online and in person to support the use of technology, use tools to increase student engagement and understanding. So a common theme here is the combination piece. Okay, so part obviously that word blended tells us that we're bringing two things together. Um, Students learning in online tools as well as within the classroom, partially physical face-to-face and learning, all good ideas. It says ownership of content is shared by the teachers and the students using technology. Nice, yeah. So if any of you are currently existing in a blended learning environment, I'd love for you at any point to share your thoughts with the group in the chat. It's always in a group this size, there are so many people whose voices can influence their peers. So please be sure to share your successes, your challenges with blended learning. Let's see what the blended learning kind of, we'll call them gurus, say about about this. So blended learning, and there's a book by Michael Horn. It's actually called Blended. He works through the Christensen Institute, which is one of the first people to kind of coin the phrase around this. By definition, blended learning it is a formal education program. So it's not like a whimsical kids kind of show up when they feel like it and learn whenever they want to. It's not unschooling. It's part online, okay, like you all mentioned. Students have elements of control over the time, the pace, the path, and the place of their learning. Part of the work happens away from home. So that could be, in some instances, a student is reporting to a library to have a small group with someone. In other instances, a student is reporting to a school, some kind of brick and mortar location. So it's not 100% home-based learning like we just experienced through the emergency school closures. And there's definitely a plan and a path. So what is the attempt in a true blended learning model is to try to map out a student's learning path. And the things that they complete along the way are meant to boost their learning on a personalized level. So it's a formal education program. The student learns at least in part through online learning. And again, those elements of students' ownership is there. So I'm glad that came up in the chat. This is another look at, what is blended learning versus what is learning with technology? Because certainly before the school closures, lots of us were learning with technology. We had tech-infused classrooms. And the difference with blended learning is that shift to a personal ownership piece from the student. Devices that students have access to, it's not that they're all getting on IXL at the same time, on the same day, doing the same lessons. They're really used in a way to optimize personalization and individual learning. And the idea behind blended versus tech-rich is that in tech-rich instruction, we might still be living in a very traditional environment, and tech is enhancing some of the things that we do. But in a blended learning environment, we're rethinking fundamentally what instruction is and what teaching and learning can look like in a different experience. Nobody is going to show up in the fall and say, I have fundamentally shifted what I've done. It's not fair to think that any of you are going to be able to do that because it requires planning, patience, practice, putting things in action to see how it could work. But these are just some key components that you can keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the shift. And if your school administrators present a schedule to you that involves half the time face-to-face with your kids and the other half of the time they're in some kind of online learning situation, fundamentally, what shifts can you make in instruction that isn't just taking your traditional lessons and digitizing them? When I first started training as a Google trainer and I talked to teachers about Google Classroom, I implored with them, I said, do not just take a traditional activity, a worksheet, for example. And I'm not hating on worksheets. There's some great ones out there that really make kids think. But let's just say you had a really traditional type of worksheet and you put it in Google Classroom and you want the kids to complete it in Google Classroom. That is not a fundamental shift about learning. That is simply digitizing a worksheet. and nothing that you've done with the tech has improved the experience for the learner. So instead of thinking about how we can just take our traditional curriculum and the activities we would traditionally do in our regular scope and sequence, we have this really cool opportunity now, as stressful as it is, to rethink what is important for kids and what types of activities we're doing with kids and what types of activities we should be doing with kids and what types of products they could be creating as a result of their learning. So this is a really cool time for that kind of experimentation. So you might see other references to blended learning, online learning, virtual learning, e-learning. I never know what to call it when I'm referencing it. Like even for our BCIU work, we've called it distance learning because at this point, we've all been at a distance. So what are some similarities and differences among these learning formats? And what do you think should be our primary focus when we're planning for next year? If you could at this time identify your primary focus as a classroom teacher or as a building principal, what would it be? Just throw it in the chat if you're comfortable. What should be our primary focus as we're starting to envision this kind of work? And it might be different for everybody. And if you just want to think about it in your head, that is totally fine too. What do you think? Totally, you guys are all on the same page. So we know that we want to make this experience engaging for students. We don't care what we call it. We don't need a fancy title. We don't need it to be like to fit or check off boxes. We want meaningful learning for students. We want them to be there with us, whether we're face to face or whether it's in a digital format. We want that. So now it's like, how do we get them there? And of course, making sure everyone has access to the learning. So how can we do that? This is a continued lesson from this spring, where the more well organized you are as a district, as a building, as a classroom, the better chance you have of student engagement, simply because you're removing barriers to engagement. We need to figure out what the digital home is going to be for our kids, because if we start out face to face, I think all of us understand the reality of another surge of this pandemic kind of coming through. No one's saying it's definitely going to happen. No one's saying it's not going to happen, but the possibility is real. And at any point, schools could shut their doors again. So from day one, we have to make sure that kids are comfortable and fluent in a digital space that will support their learning if they're not able to return to school the next day. So the question is, should the digital home be uniform within a district or building level? District-wide, I would say, is difficult to push something district-wide just because of the readiness and developmental levels. K through 12 are just so varied. However, as a former principal, I will tell you that if you have a consistent home in your building, life will be easier for your families. And maybe for the elementary level, you do a K2 home, that's appropriate, and then you do a 3-6 home. But as much as I value and honor teacher autonomy, in this situation, I would not as a principal, I would be very hesitant to let every teacher choose their own digital home. I would have a consistent space so that my parents could learn to rely on it. And my students could learn to rely on it. Because we know, even if we teach our students to be fluent with the homes, they're going to require family support, especially at those younger levels. So maybe at 7 to 12, maybe your district has decided Schoology is the way to go. If your district decides that, and if they're supporting you in that, that is what I recommend. Follow your district recommendations, and work with your administrators to find and advocate for the tools that work best for you. Now, I'm not saying if everyone's required to use Google Classroom that you can't also add something connected to your Google Classroom that can help kids engage in a certain way. For example, something like a Google site is a really great place to build out content. And you could always link to your Google site as a material in Google Classroom. And so you have that little partnership of a digital home. And your home doesn't have to be one single website. It can be like a partnership, or maybe like 3 things that kids are always going to. They know, as long as they're fluent, as long as they know where to find communications, where to get assignments, where to find content and learning materials, and how to submit work. And the more consistent you are with that, the more successful your kids will be in terms of engagement. They're going to learn to rely on it. It's going to be a sense of comfort for them in a very discomforting time. And it's really kind of an important decision that you want to make with your teams. Some schools are getting on schedules where work is released on like a Sunday night or a Monday morning, and students have until the end of the week to finish that work. If students are not checking in face-to-face, the types of things you want to consider around schedules is that schedules cannot exist in a home environment in an equitable way. You simply cannot expect a child to complete an assignment on your timeline when anything could be going on in their home life. So we need to give that grace and that flexibility. And when we talk about planning under the opportunities phase, you're going to see how I have a digital learning plan example. You look at it from a more holistic planning standpoint. Okay. So when we're talking about blended learning, and let's just pretend, because that's what we have to do right now, because we don't have answers, let's just pretend that students are coming to you face-to-face at some point during the week. For those of you who worked with the hybrid learning model at any point in your career, it goes by many names. And for those of you who are classroom teachers at the elementary level, you might look at something like station rotation, and elementary teachers say to me, well, of course, like this is this is just what we do. This is centers. This is what we're good at this. In the station rotation model, there is a segment where online learning is what's happening during the station. And so for your students, that could be happening if we're off campus Monday, Wednesday, Friday, let's say. They could be doing that there. And then when they're in person, the teacher is working with them in differentiated small groups based on their progress. And when the teacher is not with them face-to-face, but they are in class, they could be taking that time with their peers, doing collaborative work, doing independent project work, and you just have this nice kind of flow going on. And in the schools that are privileged to have other adults available, a lot of paraprofessionals can help with some of the management and the support pieces while the teacher is working with a small group. This maximizes your impact as a teacher when you have limited time with students, because you are pulling kids at a certain level who need certain types of instruction, and you are able to give that in a nice, intimate, small group setting. This might not happen every single day that you're together, but when you're planning things out, if your kids are away from you a couple of days a week, they're going to be coming to you face-to-face all over the place. Some of them might have gotten the online work done while they were gone, and some of them might not have. So what are you going to do when they get back into class? It will be very difficult to approach it as a whole group lesson every single time if the kids are all at different places. So the station rotation model is something that you could think about infusing as you bring in. For my secondary teachers who are like, this is not really my cup of tea, Caitlin Tucker is my go-to resource on station rotation. She is actually a secondary English teacher. It is the model she uses in her class the majority of the time, and she's done a lot of sharing of resources around that. This is also from the blended learning resource site. They kind of map it out that way. So you can just think about when the kids are face-to-face, I'm going to have FaceTime with them in small group instruction or whole group if it makes sense. They're going to have time for checking in at their online instruction. Because think about this too, if we are limiting class sizes, let's just say we have to stick with the 6 feet apart situations. You might have a time when half of your class is going to be with you and the other half is going to be in the cafeteria online doing some of their blended work. Okay, so your stations might be spread out across the building, not just in your classroom. So this is like, it's just a bigger concept that you can think about. We might not be limited to one classroom. This might be among the whole building. But this opportunity, again, to maximize student peer-to-peer interactions, because we know our kids are missing that right now. They need that peer time. So if you can build in that opportunity for collaborative activities and stations, co-projects, things like that, that will work out pretty well and just make them feel like coming to school is worth it. Here's another idea, flex learning. This is just a different model of blended learning, but they can really kind of flex their day. The kids have a huge amount of control. I'm thinking of either classes where you've really built a strong relationship of culture of learning and trust with your students, and or more independent secondary students. These types of flex schedules will allow students to be with teachers for maximum instruction time. They might break out into smaller groups. There might be a library space or other different social space where they can be together or work independently. And then there might be collaborative rooms. So you're looking at your physical location, and instead of saying room 125 is Mr. Jones's room, you're designing an area, areas among the building that kids can go to learn in different ways. And some of our schools have done things like this. I'm thinking of Governor Mifflin High School. They do some personalized learning initiatives where students are responsible for getting their work done in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different locations, some online, some offline, some face-to-face, some collaborative. So again, this doesn't get invented overnight. You're not going to have this all figured out by Monday, but think through opportunities, content areas, courses where this might make sense. Then there's like the most kind of free space. And this, if we're thinking about truly doing what's best for kids and personalizing the experience, there could be the opportunity for some of our young adult learners to learn through a la carte learning, which is they're taking an online course, so a mostly digital learning experience with a teacher who's the course designer and the content expert and the feedback expert, and they're able to come into the physical space if needed, but they don't have to. So are there any students who could exist in a completely a la carte, totally online only learning experience at your secondary level? Probably. And there are some schools who build their own digital learning spaces. There are some whose students go to Berks Online. There's lots of ways to approach that, but I just wanted to share that as an opportunity as well. So lots of you mentioned this idea of technology use, and we can't just simply pick platforms and put kids on them because it's a matter of convenience for us. Like I know we did a lot of this during emergency planning. We said, oh, well, okay, IXL has math, they have literacy. So let's just get every kid an IXL account and that could be their blended learning. And, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that particular platform, but when it's the kind of content exploration, that is a matter of convenience. We can, since we know what's coming in terms of needing to infuse more technology, choice, ownership, and voice through authentic learning should be our goal with using technology. Giving kids options for project creation, giving kids ownership over the types of things that they're learning, the path, letting them choose certainly what's going on and provide their voice into the learning, the pathways and the goals and the outcomes that they wish to have. And even now, as we're able to, giving them more authentic learning experiences connected to the real world. And certainly some of our options are limited by our inability to be together as often as we'd like and as big of a group as we like. But these are some things to keep in mind when you're bringing those tech pieces in. Just this morning, my super friends at New America created the pandemic planning for distance learning considerations piece, and they have actual scenarios in there where they pretend school ABC chooses this is how it looks. These are some considerations. This was designed by Christina Ishmael, Rebecca Heiser, and Jennifer Payne. And I linked to it here on my slides. This, if you would like to pass this along to your school administrators, I highly recommend it. It looks like this. They break down the different scenarios. They call them brick to click, which I kind of like, or click to brick, and then blended learning, and then online learning. So they're mapping out 4 scenarios, which they say none of these are perfect. Each has its own set of challenges and drawbacks. We recognize that each district is approaching it from different contexts, levels of funding, resources, and support. That is the given. There is no silver bullet here for any of us. Brick to click takes into account that in late August or September 1, let's just say, we are going to resume traditional in-person classes. But we are going to build in flexibility so that if we have to quickly pivot out of class, we can do it without trauma. So you are building in the opportunity for your teachers to get professional development and best practices in online learning. They're going to need time to process it and digest it. The goal is to return to in-person class, but the expectation would be that if we can't, you are able to continue the learning with what you are going to do. So that is taking into consideration the likelihood of another rise of infection, and that we're going to have to kind of, like here, example, if the number of cases jumps, the district would need to send home instructional materials within 48 hours and then continue learning. So it makes sure that everyone is nimble enough, and nimble is a good thing to be right now, to attack these changes. The second scenario is click to brick, where the district decides, you know what, we're going to start the year with online learning because we've been doing it now for a couple months. We're getting pretty good at it. We're going to just hone up our skills, and we are planning to resume traditional in-person classes when it is safe. So your school leaders are working with the government and health officials and all that kind of stuff. So they are teaching teachers and support staff to use online learning environments meaningfully. They will get ongoing professional development, and academic instruction will be conducted online for the duration of the year, while plans for in-person learning focus on relationship building and advising students. So the online learning click piece is where the academics happen, and when we're actually together, we're focusing on the SEL piece. So that is another consideration. And then blended learning, we've just discussed that some of the learning takes place online, some of the learning takes place face-to-face, but There are, and we saw this happen, schools who were already comfortable with blended learning, they transitioned rather smoothly to even to the emergency piece because they already had those things in place. And of course, option D would be doing everything online, and not risking bringing anybody in for whatever reason. That is worth a read, and I just gave it a cursory kind of overview. But thinking about what it could look like, honestly, it could look like any of those at any time. So how do we get comfortable with that? So again, and we are going to hit roadblocks in bringing any of these things to life. Your district's going to have specific roadblocks that are different from other districts, but first and foremost, keeping everybody safe is going to be one of the things we're going to have to address. And I know you've seen pictures of other international schools who have returned to face-to-face and the types of things that they're doing. This is a school in Denmark, so you can see they're utilizing their tables, and it's 1 kid per table. There are schools where they're taking temperatures of the students on the way in, and all the kids and adults are wearing masks. This was a particularly amusing picture of kids who made hats that would socially distance their peers. This type of stuff is happening. There are procedures in place. And then there are other countries who, like I read about New Zealand this morning, has 0 COVID patients in their hospitals right now because of the social distancing measures that they took. We are going to have to look at some things like this. At the minimum, we're going to have to look at things like social distancing, the movement patterns, how many students are allowed in the bathroom at a time, who's disinfecting after that, what about shared faculty kitchens, how are you expected to move around the building, do you want people passing each other in the hallways, personal protective equipment, masks. What about our school nursing staff? How available are they? We know there are buildings who don't have a school nurse all day. And then how are we going to enforce and reinforce hand washing routines? These are all things that your district leadership teams are attempting to figure out: disinfecting, sanitizing, busing, how that's going to work. So it's not like, as much as your district leaders want to give you answers right now, all of the logistics that they're going through, the busing schedules, the childcare needs, food services, what do extracurriculars look like? How are they going to build a schedule and a routine for learning that meets the needs of families to the best of our ability? And it's a huge challenge, and I think we all know that. And when it is time to consider why people are coming together, when we're bringing people together, who should be coming together? Which students, what groups of students, which teachers, how long should the meeting times be, the frequency and the length? Are they going to meet in person? Could we possibly do some virtual synchronous meetings like we're doing now? What's really the purpose of coming together? Like we read in the scenarios, are we bringing kids to school to promote further academic work, or are we bringing them to school to build relationships with their peers and with their teachers and advise them and keep them strong emotionally? What is the purpose? And it might be different depending on the group that you're working with. We have to consider devices. Not every student has access to a device, even in the districts that issued them. There's the idea of devices kind of, some of them are certainly up for replacement cycles. What's the management procedures, cleaning? Do we have to bring them back in and disinfect them before they go back out? Connectivity issues. How can we possibly ensure that all kids have access to the materials if we're going to do a blended learning approach? And then equity. How are we going to ensure equitable experiences for all kids, for English learners, for students with special needs? How are we going to do that? And it's a matter of teamwork, of course, working with the trusted professionals who are skilled in working with students with special needs, and making sure that we're doing everything that we can do under the circumstances to support them. The Castle Foundation, which we turn to often, oops, my mouse goes crazy, to talk about social emotional learning, has just put out, which was shared with your district leaders, an initial guide to leveraging the power of social and emotional learning. as you prepare to reopen. And I think this is the message that our families need to hear. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of you who are parents of school age kids or even college age students. You want to know what the districts are doing to keep our kids safe, not just healthy wise physically, but mentally and emotionally safe as well. And that is why I mentioned first thing that your school leaders are thinking about this nonstop. And I know that you are too. So let's take a moment to kind of talk about the opportunities and leave with a sense of kind of ownership that we can do this. We can make this a reality for our kids. And I think that a really important thing for you to do as a district, as a school building, as a grade level team or department is to really establish your vision for what you want kids to get out of the experience. What do we want our students to have as a result of their time with us, as a result of time on using the activities that we're designing in our learning environments? Communication, if there was never a better time for bolstering your communication plans and really tightening them up, it's right now. Because I guarantee you, a parent does not want to go to 50 different places to find information about what's going to happen in the new year. How can you streamline the schedule? How can you streamline the emails that are coming or the constant contacts that are coming, the texts, the reminds, all the things to make it as clear as possible how we're going to lead kids to success in this coming year? I want to show you this example of a guide that was published by a school called Mount Vernon, and it's in Atlanta, and they certainly do a lot of innovative things in all areas. But this is called the Reunite Plan. And if I was a parent, there is nothing more that I would want to see than this type of plan that looks and feels like it has care at the center versus just trying to get through a bunch of logistical stuff. This is a plan to bring people back together. And while it does talk about nitty-gritty things like finance and operations, it talks about things that are important to me, like what's going to happen with teaching and learning in my kids. Well, here are the public health scenarios. Here's green, yellow, and red, and you know, this is in Georgia, so it's a little different than Pennsylvania. But then how are these scenarios going to guide our work? Because simply they don't have the answers either, but they are putting out these options. So first, they're saying, well, parents, we have 5 different models that we came up with our team, and this is what it could look like. And at any time, we might shift among these models. So just be prepared for that. They've got a 5-day, they've got a staggered schedule day, a 4-day, and they go through and they explain it. So as a parent, like I kind of get it, what they're doing here and what they're trying to explain, that these are still our emphasis, the learning environment. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to spread out across the school campus. We're going to maximize the use of every space, gyms, galleries, cafeterias, and we're going to make sure that we can socially distance. We have a shelter-in-place home learning plan. If we have to go back to everybody being at home, we're going to be able to do that. So this type of plan is kind of like reassuring for the families, even though there's no there's no answers like this is what we're going to do. These are the possibilities, and we've determined them to be good possibilities. For you as an instructional designer, the NIET Teaching Standards rubric, which comes from a space called Taking Great Teaching Online. This rubric I linked here for you. Oops. It has a number of different checkpoints that you can ask yourself as you're designing learning for next year. What are the most essential understandings we want kids to have? And at all possible, can we build in opportunities for inquiry, for curiosity? So many of you want the kids to stay engaged, and this is how we do it. By asking big, chunky, important questions and by allowing them to explore things that mean something to them. How do we design learning outcomes with student input when possible, and helping kids learn to self-assess? Because since our face time with them is limited or may be limited, we have to help our learners learn to assess their own habits, their own thinking, their own skill set. When you think you have a plan for where you'd like to go, it says something in terms of being helpful to create a roadmap. And it's helpful to back map that. So I know a lot of you have learned about understanding by design and that whole backwards planning theory. And if you map out your destination and ultimately where you'd like kids to be, back map from there and figure out how you're going to get there. And look for those tools and strategies that allow frequent student interactivity, creation. We've highlighted dozens of them over the last couple of months in our on-demand section, so you can definitely find things that your students would like. And when you're building learning activities, think about the ways that you've learned to infuse multimedia, to use higher order questioning, to plan for student-to-student interactions and collaboration. One thing that you can get students accustomed to doing, even if we start face-to-face, is using dialogue digitally or using discussion boards, because then if our time together gets interrupted again, those conversations can continue in a space that students are already fluent in. We want to emphasize documentation of learning. I'm doing a session on digital portfolios next week. This is a great way, even if we're broken apart from our traditional meeting times, for kids to have a space where they can document their learning and share that with their teacher and with other people who mean something to them. Then also, there are some great interactive learning programs that we can incorporate the use of. Every district has those that they have fell in love with and use, and we should continue pursuing the use of those programs to help with instruction. For feedback, utilize office hours if we're not together, or even if we are together. Utilize frequent opportunities for dialogue and conversation, and change up the assessment process. Think about how to make students more active in that process. And we talked about portfolios. So for you, for next steps, for sure, take some time to reflect if you haven't done so already, and take some time to reach out to the people you worked with most closely, those students and parents, and find out where it went well and where some tweaks would need to be made so you can plan to incorporate that. Make a plan, even if it means that you're planning before you know anything final from your district. Based on what you heard today, you might be able to sketch out some skeleton plans of what it might look like in your classroom or in your content area. And take a look at this planning tool. It's called Oreo, and it is an online learning wayfinding planner where you're mapping out an objective, responsibility, expectation, and organization. And the note here for the teacher is think holistically. How much total time do you have with students in a given week? What learning should they accomplish in that week? And then imagine how a schedule might be designed to suit those parameters. So instead of thinking about 42 minutes on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, think wholly for the week or for the cycle, however you traditionally schedule. And then map out your learning responsibility. This is the copy in Google Docs, and you can make a copy of it that you can then change for yourself. It has prior connections in here, differentiation and accommodations that are necessary. There's some UDL reflections. If you've not gone through and learned about universal design for learning, these are providing multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression to meet the needs of all learners. So you can review that as well. And this is just a way, again, you're not this isn't a daily lesson plan. That's the difference. This is a way finding your way, just like Moana plan to get through this thinking around what we need to make school for our kids as we're able to. Then it's time to act, put your plans in action, but please be gracious to yourself. Don't think that the first time through, whatever you put together is going to be the magic cure and all the kids are going to come 100% engaged. Please show yourself grace as you try new things, and grace for your students as well. And then it's constant reflection at this point. It is constant iteration. There are things that you did the first week of online learning that you did not do the third week. There are things that you just naturally reflected on based on your skill set as an educator, and just be ready, be agile for that. Have open minds, and it will be frustrating, but it can be incredibly rewarding as well to see how kids rise up during this time. I put enough for those of you really interested in this, or if you want to pass along any of this. These are all resources that talk about reopening schools, blended learning opportunities, innovative visions for schools, things that you can pull on to think more about where we are at this time. And it is a really uncertain time, of course, and everyone is going through and dealing with it in their own ways. And I just want to thank you for coming this morning, because it was such a great crowd for a topic that, like I said, I'm not able to give you a ton of answers for, and I wish I could, but hopefully this sparks some thinking for you in this realm. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate all that you're doing. Thanks again. If you would like to stick around for questions after I stop the recording, I'm happy to chat with you. This is the feedback form for Act 48 bit.ly/IU14 session feedback, and we're happy that you come and spend time with us to learn. So reach out with any questions that you have. I'm going to stop the recording. If you'd like to grab the mic, feel free to do so.